The bells of St. George's in Hanover Square had been ringing for the Duke of Ashworth's wedding since 10:30, and the woman in black came up the steps against the whole tide of London going in. She did not hurry. She had a child by the hand, a boy of 3 in a brushed wool coat, and under her other arm she carried a flat leather folio held against her ribs the way a soldier carries a thing he means to die before he surrenders. The footman at the door saw the mourning dress and the dust of the North Road on her hem, and moved to turn her aside. And she looked at them with grey-gloved calm and said, "I am expected," which was a lie, and walked past them into the church as though the lie were a key that fit every lock in England. Inside, 400 candles, and half the peerage. The Duke stood at the chancel rail in dove grey and silver, tall and very still, a man who had taught his face to give nothing away, and had paid a price for the lesson. Beside him waited Miss Sophia Wren and her £40,000 veiled in Brussels lace, her hand already half lifted toward his. The clergyman had reached the part every soul in the building knew by heart. If any man can show just cause why these two may not lawfully be joined together, I can, the woman in black said. She did not shout it. She said it the way one reads a verdict, and the acoustics of that great cold church carried it to the back wall and returned it, so that the sentence seemed to come from everywhere at once. The boy at her side, frightened by the sudden turning of so many faces, pressed against her skirts, and the candlelight caught the one thing she wore that was not black, a thin gold band threaded on a ribbon at her throat, a wedding ring worn where a wedding ring should never be, against the hollow of a widow's neck. The Duke of Ashworth turned, and every person who watched his face in that moment would describe it the same way for the rest of their lives, that the most composed man in the room went the colour of the candles, that his hand closed on the chancel rail, as if the floor had tilted, and that he said one word, very low. That was not the bride's name. Marianne. He came down the chancel steps before the clergyman could speak, before his mother could rise from the front pew, before the bride's startled gasp had finished. He came down them fast, and then he stopped, 6 feet from her, as though an invisible wall stood between them, and he looked not at her face first, which is what tells you everything about a man, but at the child, at the boy's dark hair and the set of his small jaw and the grey eyes, his own grey eyes, blinking up at 400 strangers. "Stop the ceremony," the Duke said, without turning round. Nobody moved. I said stop it. The organ, which had been holding a soft sustaining chord, died into silence. He had not seen her in 3 years. He had been told, in this very season 3 years gone, that she was dead, that the fever had taken her in the autumn of 1815, along with the child she carried, that there was nothing left to grieve over but a grave in a county he had never been permitted to visit. He had believed it because the woman who told him had never in his life lied to him about anything that mattered, and because grief, once it is given a body to bury, does not go looking for reasons to dig the body up. He had worn his own black for a year. He had stood at the head of the family his brother's death at Waterloo had left him, had taken up the title and the debts and the duty, and had finally, at 32, agreed to do the one thing his rank required, and his heart had stopped objecting to, because the heart that might have objected was 3 years in the ground. And now the dead woman stood in the aisle of St. George's, with his son's hand in hers. "You will want," Marianne said quietly, so that only the nearest pews could hear, "to send your bride somewhere kind. This is not her doing, and she should not have to stand for it." It was the first thing she said to him in 3 years, and it undid him more thoroughly than any accusation could have. because it was the kind of thing she had always said, thinking of the other woman, the wronged stranger, before she thought of herself. He had forgotten, in 3 years of mourning a saint, that the living woman had been like this, practical in the center of catastrophe, kinder than the situation deserved. "Go to the vestry," he said to her, low, "both of you. Please." The Dowager Duchess of Ashworth had reached them by now. Honoria, his mother, 61 years old and straight as a fire iron in grey lavender, took one look at the woman in black and the child and did not go pale at all. That was the thing the Duke would remember afterward, when he had time to remember things. His own face had betrayed him utterly. His mother's had not so much as flickered. She looked at Marianne the way one looks at a debt one had thought discharged. And she said, in a voice pitched for the congregation rather than for them, "This poor creature is unwell. Someone fetch her people. She has clearly mistaken the church." "I have not mistaken it," Marianne said. "Adrian." The dowager's hand closed on her son's sleeve. "Adrian, look at me. I do not know what story this woman has carried to London, but you will not throw £40,000 and the name of your house into the gutter for a mother." He did not raise his voice. He removed her hand from his sleeve with a gentleness that was somehow more terrible than violence. "How did she die?" "What? Marianne, you told me she died. You told me where. You described the room to me. How did she die, if she is standing in my church?" For the first time in the memory of anyone present, the Dowager Duchess of Ashworth had no answer ready. It lasted only a moment, but 400 people saw it. And a thing seen by 400 people in Mayfair is a thing that cannot be unseen. The vestry of St. George's was a small panelled room that smelled of beeswax and old paper, and the Duke shut the door on the whole staring world and stood with his back against it, as if to hold the world out by force. The boy had been given a sugared almond by a flustered verger, and sat on a bench, swinging his legs, watching the 2 grown people with the frank attention of the very young. "His name is Thomas," Marianne said. "He was 3 in March. He has never been ill a day in his life, which I mention because you were told he died at birth, and I would like you to look at how false that was." Her voice did not shake. She had clearly rehearsed not letting it shake across 400 miles of road. "I did not come to ruin your wedding, Adrian. I did not know there was a wedding until 11 days ago. I came because a man named Sefton died in March, your mother's man of business, and his clerk, who did not know what he was sending, sent his late master's papers to the only address in them that had no London solicitor attached. Mine, the widow Calvert, of Hartmore, in the North Riding." "Calvert," he repeated. The name meant nothing, and therefore meant everything. "It is the name I have answered to for 3 years. A young war widow, retired to the country on a small annuity. That was the story your mother bought for me, and I was too broken to argue with it, because the man I had married had cast me off without a word. And a woman who has been cast off learns very quickly to take whatever name will let her keep her child fed." She set the leather folio on the vestry table, and then I opened Mr. Sefton's papers, looking for nothing, and I found these. She opened the folio. Letters, 2 dozen of them, perhaps more, the seals broken, the paper soft with handling, but handled, he saw, by someone other than the woman they were addressed to. He crossed the small room and picked one up, because his hand had moved before his judgment could stop it. And he knew his own writing, and he knew the date, and he knew the words, because he had bled them onto the page in the worst month of his life. "If you are anywhere that this can reach you, write 1 line, 1 word. I am not the man my family says I am. I never agreed to any of it. Marianne, If you are alive, they were never delivered, she said. Every letter you wrote me, your mother's man collected and kept. Every letter I wrote you came to the same drawer. We were both told the other was dead, Adrian, and we were both made to grieve correctly, in our correct black, in our correct counties, 400 miles apart. For 3 years, because your mother decided that a country physician's daughter was a stain she could afford to wash out with a forged death notice and an annuity. She looked at him steadily. You did not abandon me. I have known that for 11 days. It is the only thing that gave me the courage to come, and it is the cruelest thing I have ever learned, because 3 years is 3 years, and I cannot have them back. He stood in the middle of the vestry holding his own old grief in his hand, and could not speak. Say something, she said, and for the first time the rehearsed calm thinned, and he heard underneath it the woman who had crossed England with a child and a folio and the smallest possible quantity of hope say anything, even if it is only that it is too late. I married you, he said. Yes, in the spring of 1813, at St. Bridget's in Lambeth, by licence, with the curate Pelham and the sexton's wife to witness it, before Edmund died, before there was any dukedom to want or to guard, when I was a younger son with 300 a year, and you were the only thing in London He stopped. His composure, the thing he was famous for, broke clean across like a green stick. I have a son. You have a son. He went to the boy then. He knelt down on the vestry floor in his dove-grey wedding clothes, slowly, the way a man approaches a horse that does not know him. And the boy regarded him with great seriousness and offered him, after due consideration, the second sugared almond from his sticky fist. And the Duke of Ashworth, who had not wept at his brother's funeral, nor at the false news of his wife's death, nor at anything in the long disciplined years between, took the sweet from his son's hand and bowed his head over it, and wept without any sound at all. He had asked her to marry him in the spring of 1813, in the worst possible way, which was the only way a younger son with 300 a year could do it honestly. They had been standing in the physic garden behind her father's house in Lambeth, where she dried the herbs her father prescribed. And he had not gone down on one knee, because going down on one knee promised a future a third son could not afford. I cannot give you a single thing the world counts, he had said. No house that is mine, no carriage. My brother will have all of it, and I will have a colonel's commission, or a country living, and a wife the family will never once invite to dinner. I am asking you to marry beneath your happiness, Marianne, and I have nothing to offer that makes it sensible. You have insulted me twice in one breath, she had said, snapping a stem of rosemary between her fingers, which is a particular talent. First, by supposing I counted any of those things, and second, by supposing I needed them explained. She had looked up at him then, level, unafraid. A physician's daughter who had set bones and closed eyes, and was frightened of very little. I do not want the dinners you cannot get me invited to. I want the man who came back through this garden 4 times this month to argue about a book. Ask me the real question, or go home. Will you marry me in secret, and be poor and be mine, he had said, and let me spend the rest of my life proving it was not a mistake? Yes, she had said, and it will not be a mistake. The mistake would be the asking it any later. They had married 3 weeks afterward at St. Bridget's, by licence, with the curate Pelham and the sexton's wife to witness it, and he had put a thin gold band on her finger and thought himself, that morning, the luckiest poor man in England. He had not been wrong. He had only been early, by 4 years, and 1 war, and 1 forged death. for the happiness the marriage promised. There is a particular danger in a reunion, which is that it persuades the reuniting parties that the difficulty is behind them. It is not. The Duke knew it before Marianne did, because the Duke knew his mother. He had left the bride's family in the keeping of his cousin, and a great deal of profuse apology. Miss Wren, to her lasting credit, had lifted her veil, looked once at the child, and said only, "I think, Your Grace, that the wedding is the least important thing that has happened in this church today," and had gone out to her father's carriage with more dignity than the occasion had any right to expect. That kindness would matter later, for now it had cleared the field, and the field was the long gold drawing-room of Ashworth House, where the Dowager Duchess waited for her son with her hands folded and her account already prepared. "You have made a spectacle," she said, when he came in alone. "It can be mended. Spectacles are always mended. The ton forgets everything by August. The woman is a known widow, living quietly in the north. Whatever she has told you, whatever scrap of paper she waved in a vestry, it is the word of a Mrs. Calvert of nowhere against the word of the Dowager Duchess of Ashworth, and I promise you the world will know which to believe. You told me she was dead. I told you what would let you live." For the first time she rose and crossed to him, and there was no cruelty in her face. That was what made it unbearable. There was conviction. "Listen to me, because I will only say it plainly once. When your brother died at Waterloo, and the whole weight of 400 years came down on you, you had a secret wife who was the daughter of a country doctor, and a child got on her before there was a title to legitimize. And if any of it had been known, you would have been the Duke who married down in the dark, laughed at in every drawing-room, your son's blood questioned at every door for the rest of his life. I removed the problem. I gave the girl money and a name, and a quiet life. I gave you a clean grief and a clean future. I would do it again tomorrow. I will not apologize for protecting this house from a misalliance it could not survive. That misalliance," the Duke said, "is my marriage. That child is my heir, and you let me bury them both while they were alive." He looked at her for a long moment, and what was in his face was not rage. Rage, she could have answered. It was the slow closing of a door. "There is a parish register at St. Bridget's, Lambeth, with my marriage in it, in Pelham's hand. There is a license on file at the faculty office. There are the letters you stole in your own dead man's drawer, which prove the whole of it. You have not got the word of a nobody against a duchess, mother. You have got the law of England against a woman who forged a death." He went to the door. "Marianne and my son are under this roof tonight, as the Duchess of Ashworth and the heir to it. You will give them every courtesy, and then, in the morning, you will go to the dower house at Ashworth Magna, and you will live there, and you will not come to London again while I am alive to keep you out of it." He had reckoned, in that moment, that he had won. He was wrong, and he should have known he was wrong, because his mother had not built 30 years of unquestioned command by surrendering the instant a son raised his voice. She watched him go, and she did not weep. And the next morning she did not go to Ashworth Magna. She went very early and very privately to a man she knew at Doctors' Commons, and to a clergyman of flexible memory, and she began, calmly, methodically, with the patience of a woman who has been managing this family her whole life, to take the register apart. 3 days the city gave them. 3 days in which the impossible thing settled into something almost ordinary. The boy learned the long gallery of Ashworth House and the names of the painted horses in it. The Duke learned that his son was afraid of thunder and unafraid of dogs, and would eat a whole dish of stewed plums given the smallest opportunity. And the Duke and his recovered wife, who had been married 5 years and known each other across a table for only 3 days of it, moved around one another in the cautious wonder of people learning whether the thing they had each grieved was still alive enough to touch. They were in the library on the 3rd evening, the boy long asleep, the fire low. She had the ribbon off at last, and the gold band on her finger where it belonged, and she kept turning it as though she did not quite trust it to stay. He stood close to her, closer than the 3 days had yet allowed, and the old current ran between them as if no time at all had passed, the unbearable awareness of a hand a few inches from a hand. "I used to be able to do this," he said roughly. "Stand near you. I have forgotten how it is survivable." "It is not survivable," she said. "It never was. That was always the trouble with you." He lifted his hand and laid it against the side of her face, the lightest possible touch, and she closed her eyes and turned into it, and the few inches of air between them began to disappear, slowly, the way the most dangerous things always happen slowly. The library door opened. It was the Duke's cousin, white-faced, with a folded paper in his hand and an apology already on his lips. "Adrian, forgive me. It could not wait until morning. Your mother has—" He stopped, looked at Marianne, and chose to say it anyway. "There is a notice going to the morning papers, and there is a man at Doctors' Commons swearing the Lambeth Register was tampered with, that the marriage entry is a forgery in a curate's hand, written in after the fact. She has got Pelham's own bishop to say Pelham was a known drunkard who would witness anything for a guinea. She is going to say the marriage never happened at all." The air that had been about to vanish between them came rushing back. "Cold. She cannot," Marianne said. "It is in the register. It is the truth." "The truth," the Duke said quietly, "and the register are 2 different objects, and she has just told me she means to make them disagree. A forged death she could be charged with, but if she can make it seem the marriage was the forgery, that a grasping widow and a drunk curate invented an entry to graft a bastard onto a dukedom, then it is you in the dock, Marianne, not her, and our son becomes exactly the thing she always called him." He was already moving, already reaching for the bell, the candour of the firelit moment gone hard and bright as a blade. "She has had 30 years to learn how this city decides what is true. We have had 3 days. She left in the dark. She did not tell him she was going to do it, because she knew he would forbid it, and she had not crossed 400 miles to be forbidden things in her own husband's house. But she lay awake in the grey hour before dawn and understood, with the cold clarity that had kept her and her son alive for 3 years, exactly what the next day would be. It would be the dowager's word, and the dowager's bishop, and the dowager's man at Commons against a widow from nowhere, in the newspapers, where her son's name would be a question mark forever. The Duke would fight it. He would spend the whole weight of the dukedom fighting it, and he might even win the law of it, but he could not win the story of it, because the story was already written in a hand 30 years more practiced than his, and a story, once it is in the morning papers, is true enough to follow a boy to his grave. There was only one thing that could break a story like that, and it was not a duke's authority. It was the one witness the dowager had been so careful to discredit before he could be heard. A known drunkard who would witness anything for a guinea. She had named him to bury him. She had also, in naming him, told Marianne exactly where the whole edifice was load-bearing. Mr. Pelham, the curate who had married them, was alive. Marianne knew it because Mr. Sefton's papers had known it. There had been an annuity to a clergyman in Greenwich, among them, a small quarterly sum paid to keep a man quiet and comfortable and out of the way. The dowager had not killed Pelham. She had pensioned him. And a pensioned man who learns that his pension's mistress is about to swear in the public papers that he is a drunkard, and a forger is a man who has just been robbed of the one thing he was paid to protect. His peace. She took a hackney to Greenwich at first light with her wedding lines folded against her heart, and she found the curate Pelham at his breakfast, an old man now, neat and frightened, and entirely sober. And she did not beg him. She laid the morning's first edition on his table, the one the cousin had brought, with the dowager's notice in it. And she let him read what the woman who paid his annuity had said of him in front of all London. Then she said, "She has decided that you are the lie, Mr. Pelham, so that I cannot be the truth. Tomorrow every parish in England will know your name as the drunkard who forged a duke's marriage. I cannot give you back your good name, but I can give you the chance to stand up in front of the people who took it and tell them whose hand really wrote that register. After that, you may have your quiet back, and your annuity may go to the devil, because I will keep you myself for the rest of your life if it comes to it." She held out her hand. "Will you come to London with me and tell the truth out loud?" The old man looked at the newspaper for a long time. Then he wiped his mouth and stood and reached for his coat. The Duke found her gone at 8 and nearly went out of his mind. He found her again at noon, because there was only one place in London that day where the question of his marriage was being decided, and it was the long gold drawing-room of Ashworth House, where his mother had assembled with the genius for theatre that had always been her true gift, exactly the audience required to make a thing true. 2 newspaper men, the bishop, the family solicitor, the curious and powerful cousin who would carry the verdict to every club by nightfall, and Miss Wren's father, Mr. Wren, the shipping magnate, brought to hear how grievously his daughter had been deceived by a fraudulent marriage and a counterfeit child. The Duke came in to stop it, and found he did not need to because his wife was already standing in the centre of the room. "You have all been brought here," Marianne was saying, in the clear, unhurried voice of a woman who has stopped being afraid of anyone present, "to be told that I forged a marriage, that a curate and I, between us, invented an entry in the register at St. Bridget's to fasten my son onto this house. Her Grace has spent 3 days preparing you to believe it, and she has prepared you very well, and I will not waste your time pretending you do not half believe it already." She turned to the 2 newspaper men. "So I have brought you the curate, not the drunkard Her Grace described to you this morning. The man. Ask him yourselves whose hand is in that register, and whose money has been paid to him these 3 years, to keep him out of London, and by whom?" And Mr. Pelham, sober and shaking and magnificent, told them. He told them the date, and the licence, and the sexton's wife who had stood as the second witness, and was living yet in Southwark, and would say the same. He told them of the quarterly annuity, and the name on the bank draft, and the letter. He had kept the letter. An old frightened man keeps such things, in which Mr. Sefton, on the dowager's instruction, had directed him to remove himself to Greenwich, and remain there and forget what he had witnessed. He laid it all out in the centre of the gold drawing-room, and the 2 newspaper men wrote and wrote, and the bishop went the colour of ash, and the Dowager Duchess of Ashworth stood very straight by the window, and understood, perhaps for the first time in her life, that there was a thing in the room she could not command. "You see," Marianne said to her, almost gently, when the curate had finished, "you should not have called him a drunkard in the papers. A man will let you bury him. He will not let you bury his name and his peace both. You taught me that. You taught it to me 3 years ago when you took mine. And the Duke, who had stood in the doorway through the whole of it because he understood, being no fool, that this was hers to do, and that to step in front of her now would be to take from her the one thing she had crossed England to win, said quietly into the silence that followed, "Mr. Wren, I think you can see your daughter was not deceived by my wife. She was nearly made the instrument of a crime against her by my mother. I will call on Miss Wren myself to tell her so, and to thank her for the kindness she showed in this very church 3 days ago, which I will not forget." Then he crossed the room at last, past the newspaper men and the bishop, and the ruin of his mother's 30 years, and he stopped in front of Marianne and did the thing a duke is never permitted to do. He took her hand and raised it to his mouth in front of every witness in the room, the hand with the thin gold band on it, the ring that had spent 3 years on a ribbon at a widow's throat. And he said, loudly enough for the newspaper men to hear and print, "Her Grace the Duchess of Ashworth, my wife, since the spring of 1813. Write it correctly." The Dowager Duchess went to Ashworth Magna after all, and then, when even the country proved too near the noise of what the papers had made of her, to a house outside Bath, where she lived another 9 years in the company of a paid companion, and a great deal of silence, and where, it was said, she never once spoke her grandson's name. She was not transported, and she was not ruined in law, because the Duke, in the end, did not prosecute his own mother, but the world had read the curate's testimony in the morning editions, and the world withdrew from Honoria Hale the one thing she had ever truly possessed, which was the power to be believed. For a woman who had governed by being believed, it was a sentence longer than any court could have passed. The curate Pelham kept his annuity because the Duke insisted on paying it himself for the rest of the old man's days. And that, Pelham always said, was the part nobody believed and the part that mattered most. A year later, on a morning in early summer, the Duke of Ashworth came down to the breakfast room at Ashworth House and found his wife already at the window with their son, and a second, smaller commotion underway in a cradle by the hearth that was new since the autumn. A daughter, 3 months old, who had her mother's dark eyes and an unreasonable opinion about being put down. The long gallery beyond was full of light. Thomas was 4 now, and had appointed himself protector of the cradle and informant general of the household. And he was at that moment explaining to his father, with great gravity, that the baby could not yet be trusted with a sugared almond, and that he, Thomas, would therefore be obliged to eat hers. Marianne wore no black any more. She had given every stitch of it away the week the papers ran the curate's testimony, all but one thing, which was the length of plain ribbon that had once carried her wedding ring against her throat. She kept that. She had it still, coiled in the small drawer of her writing desk, where the most important things go, and now and again, when the house was quiet, she would take it out and run it through her fingers and put it back, not because she wished to remember the 3 years, but because she wished never to forget how near a thing it had been, and how a forged register had nearly outlived the truth, and how it had been a frightened old man in Greenwich, and a folio of stolen letters, and her own 2 feet on the North Road that had carried the day. And not, for once in any of these stories, a rescue arriving from above. The Duke came and stood behind her at the window, and put his arms around her and the child between them, and she leaned back into him, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, because the rule between them now was that they were allowed to stand this close, as long as they liked, with the door open and the whole staring world welcome to look. "You went to Greenwich without telling me," he said at last. Against her hair, he had said it perhaps a dozen times over the year, and it had stopped being a reproach some months ago and become a kind of private liturgy, a thing he said only to hear her answer. "I did," she said. You might have lost. You went anyway. I had already lost 3 years, Marianne said, watching their son negotiate with the cradle. I was not going to lose the 4th, waiting for someone to give me back my own name. Some things a woman has to walk into a room and take. She turned her head and looked up at him, and the old current ran between them, undimmed, as it would run between them for 40 years. You stopped your wedding for me, Your Grace. The least I could do was win the marriage. Outside, the bells of a nearer church were ringing the hour, and they did not sound like the bells of St. George's at all. Not a tide one fought up the steps against, but only the morning, telling them what time it was in the ordinary Recco.